September 11th, 2018. The skies over New York are dark, soaked with rain, and wrapped in dense cloud. Air India Flight 101 is minutes away from landing at JFK, closing out a 14-hour polar flight from New Delhi. But as the aircraft lines up with the runway, something goes terribly wrong. The ILS, the system that guides pilots in poor visibility, fails. Then a critical altitude sensor goes dark. Then the collision avoidance system. Then, a false alarm about the landing gear not being down. One by one, the aircraft's core instruments begin to fail. The pilots are now flying blind. 357 lives are on board. And in the very skies where disaster once struck on this same date, a chilling possibility looms again. But what happened next didn't just save a plane. It exposed a terrifying truth. The Boeing 777 wasn't telling the whole story. And the deeper investigators looked, the more obvious it became. What really happened on Flight 101 is not what we've been told. The flight began like any other. A flagship long-haul service from India's capital to New York, packed to capacity. 4 pilots were on board. 2 active, 2 on standby for the extended journey. They were flying one of the most advanced aircraft in Air India's fleet, a Boeing 7730ER with twin GE90 engines and nearly a decade of service behind it. But just before departure, a non-critical fault was noted. The auxiliary power unit, the APU, was down. Not a big deal on paper, since main engines were operational. The captain, erring on the side of caution, ordered 800 kilograms of extra fuel to cover an alternate route if needed. That one decision would soon become their lifeline. As the plane took off, everything seemed normal, until it climbed into Pakistani airspace. At 30,000 feet, the first warning appeared. Single-source radio altimeter. That meant 2 of the plane's 3 critical radar altitude sensors had failed. Only 1 remained. The problem? They had no way of knowing if the last one was accurate. Not a serious issue at cruising altitude, but potentially deadly during landing, when absolute precision is everything. And that was only the beginning. 10 hours later, the second failure struck. The TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance System, shut down mid-air. This wasn't just a luxury feature. TCAS acts like an air traffic controller inside the cockpit. It warns pilots when another aircraft is too close, often giving seconds of life-saving time. Without it, they were flying blind in crowded airspace. Still, the pilots pressed on. But now, with 2 critical failures and a dead APU, patterns began to emerge. Different systems, unrelated functions, all breaking down at once. Not due to weather, not due to turbulence, but something internal, something systemic. By the time they reached New York airspace, the rain had intensified. Visibility was poor. Low clouds clung to the sky at just 200 feet. That meant the pilots had to rely on their ILS, Instrument Landing System, to guide them in. But when they tried to lock onto the signal, nothing happened. The ILS failed completely. They attempted to switch to a GPS-based LNAV-VNAV approach, far less precise, and only acceptable if they could see the runway visually. With clouds so low, that was nearly impossible. Then, as if the aircraft hadn't done enough, a new alarm blared, falsely reporting that the landing gear wasn't down. It was. But in those critical moments, the crew couldn't afford to guess. The pilots aborted the landing. With only 1 altimeter working, no collision avoidance system, a dead ILS, a ghost warning about the gear, and weather closing in, they called off the approach and climbed to 2,000 feet. ATC cleared them for a hold, but they were running out of options, and fast. Their alternate airports, Newark and Stewart, were also reporting cloud ceilings too low for a safe visual landing. JFK, their original destination, was still shrouded in clouds. They began requesting updates. Anything. Albany? Too far. Boston? Too low. Washington? Worse. Time and fuel were running out. Remember that extra 800 kilos of fuel? That was the only reason they weren't declaring an emergency, yet. Eventually, a miracle surfaced. Newark reported a marginal improvement. Cloud ceiling had lifted to 400 feet, still below the pilot's visual minimums, but it was the best option they had. They made the call. One more attempt, this time at Newark. But now, the aircraft was so low on fuel, they had no option left for another go-around. This would be it. And still, with every critical system they normally depended on disabled, they were relying on a single altimeter. One input, no backup, no autoland, no computer-guided path. They were flying an aircraft meant to land itself, entirely by hand. The descent into Newark wasn't smooth. As the aircraft approached 1,000 feet, they realized they were too high and drifting right of the runway centerline. The captain pushed the nose down to regain the correct descent path, but the aircraft began accelerating, and then came the warning: too low. The aircraft had gone below expected glide path altitude. At 400 feet, they finally broke through the cloud base. The runway was in sight, but off-center. With seconds to act, the captain made a bold correction, lowering the nose and banking left, aligning the aircraft just in time. And then, touchdown. After 15 hours of flying, under immense pressure, with systems offline, in storm conditions, and no margin for error, Flight 101 landed, safely. But here's the part the public never got to hear. No official report was ever released. No public investigation. No transparent explanation for the string of cascading failures that nearly turned another September 11th into a headline once again. Experts now suspect a central system failure, perhaps a malfunctioning flight computer, perhaps faulty sensor data feeding incorrect values into critical systems. But no one knows for sure, because the data was never disclosed. And maybe that's the most chilling part of all. This was more than a miracle landing. It was a warning, and no one wants to talk about it. To the untrained eye, what happened inside Air India 101's cockpit may have looked like confusion. But for any experienced pilot, the truth is clear. This wasn't a crew error. It was a system-wide silence, a complete blackout of the aircraft's most critical communication and navigation aids, precisely when they were needed most. The ILS refused to lock onto the localizer. The TCAS failed. 2 of the 3 radar altimeters were dead. The auto-land system was unavailable. Even the speed brakes, used to slow the aircraft after touchdown, were reportedly non-functional. Now imagine flying a 300-ton aircraft, loaded with passengers, into one of the most crowded airspaces in the world, with only partial instruments, 0 precision landing tools, no reliable altitude redundancy, and low visibility conditions. The only thing standing between the passengers and catastrophe were the instincts of 4 pilots who had never flown together before. And somehow, they worked in perfect sync. But while they succeeded in saving lives, they unknowingly revealed something terrifying. An aircraft as advanced as the Boeing 777 can still become functionally blind, deaf, and dumb mid-air and offer the flight crew almost no help at all. What investigators suspect is even more unsettling. There was no evidence of structural damage, no weather-induced system overload, and no bird strikes or visible mechanical interference. The APU, the aircraft's backup power generator, had been reported inoperative before departure. That wasn't considered critical at the time. But now, that decision looks very different. Without the APU, the aircraft relied entirely on engine-driven generators. Any glitch in those electrical systems would cascade through the flight tech suite, and that's exactly what may have happened. Experts point to a likely culprit: the aircraft's central avionics computer, which controls diagnostics, system logic, and maintenance data. If that system began feeding corrupted data to the instruments, the results would match what happened on board: phantom failures, false gear warnings, instruments refusing to sync with external signals. This would explain why multiple unrelated subsystems failed in sequence. The root cause wasn't physical, it was digital. In essence, the aircraft was not failing in pieces, it was failing at its core. It wasn't just the loss of information, it was the injection of bad information, and in aviation, that's often worse. It misleads the crew, it masks the real threat, and it forces pilots to fly half-blind into the unknown. The flight was running out of fuel. What began as a cautious decision to load an extra 800 kilograms in Delhi had now become the razor-thin margin between survival and disaster. Every failed approach, every extra turn, every extended hold over the New York skies burned more and more of their remaining reserves. Had they gone around one more time, had they hesitated even 5 more minutes, the outcome would have been very different. And just as the pilots touched down in Newark, the skies erupted. A violent thunderstorm swept through the airport. 10 minutes later, it would have been impossible to land. The runway would have been closed. Diversions would have been mandatory. But Flight 101 had no fuel left to divert. They were out of time, out of luck. And by the time emergency services surrounded the aircraft on the tarmac, they were flying on nothing but fumes. It was one of the narrowest escapes in modern aviation history. And yet, it was met with silence. No public acknowledgement from the airline. No investigation findings. No recommendations published. The incident, though documented by air traffic communications and on-the-record cockpit transcripts, was never elevated to the level of international scrutiny it deserved. So why didn't the world hear more about this? Why was an event involving cascading instrument failure, near-zero visibility, and an emergency landing of a fully loaded 777 quietly brushed aside? Some aviation experts point to reputation management. Air India, already dealing with operational criticism and aging fleet issues, could not afford a scandal involving their flagship route on the anniversary of one of the most sensitive dates in American airspace history. Boeing, still recovering from global scrutiny following the 737 MAX disasters, had no incentive to entertain questions about critical system vulnerabilities in another major aircraft family. But perhaps the most unsettling part is that the public never demanded answers, because the story was never told in full. It remained buried in transcripts, forgotten in ATC logs, lost beneath a headline-less news cycle. And yet, the evidence speaks for itself. Every system that failed had a story behind it. Every warning light that blinked in error could have been the start of a fatal chain. And every pilot action that saved the day was a reminder that when machines go silent, it's still human skill that makes the difference. And that leaves us with one final question. What would have happened if even one of those pilots hadn't been there that day? Air India 101 didn't crash. But make no mistake, what happened that night wasn't a success story. It was a close call so razor-thin that it borders on terrifying. A fully loaded Boeing 777 flew through one of the most complex airspaces in the world with 2 failed radio altimeters, a dead ILS, no autoland, no TCAS, no APU, and a central computer system likely feeding false information to its pilots. And it survived, not because of engineering, but because of experience. Because 4 pilots worked together in perfect sync under unimaginable pressure. They didn't have visibility. They didn't have precision tools. They didn't have a margin for error. What they had was a failing aircraft, failing systems, and barely enough fuel to make one last attempt. And they made it. Just in time. 10 minutes later, a thunderstorm shut the airport down. Had they gone around again, they never would have landed. But here's the part that's truly unacceptable. We were never told the truth. No investigation report, no engineering breakdown, no system audit, just silence. As if this near disaster didn't happen at all. But it did. And it exposed something Boeing, Air India, and much of the aviation world would rather not discuss. That a perfectly airworthy aircraft can still go dark. That failures don't always explode, they can whisper. And that sometimes the only reason hundreds of people survive is because someone in the cockpit refuses to give up. This wasn't just a close call, it was a warning. And if we don't listen now, next time, we might not be so lucky. If this video opened your eyes, share it. Speak up. Because silence in aviation doesn't just hide the truth, it invites disaster. And if you want more stories that expose what others won't say out loud, hit subscribe. We're just getting started.